Very happy and excited to be part of the fourth masterclass. And this time, it's a beautiful topic, very interesting, insightful, and I'm sure it brings me fond memories, as also memories that have given me nightmares. Yes, it is about synergizing knowledge and practice in the corporate world. Um, it takes me back by a few years, and those days I used to wonder, how is it that we're going to provide an opportunity for learners to apply learning at the workplace? How do we synergize learning, and how do we ensure that the synergy of learning that is got in the classrooms, or from micro learning, or from e-learning of those days, could be applied back in the flow of work? So let me take a step back to understand what are some things we did to create stickiness in learning. So first of all, as a learning architect, the most important thing is to understand the psyche of a learner. And what do I mean when I say this? What is the interest of the learner? When I say that, is there something that we can nurture for the learner, which is which has a mutual ground between what the organization wants and what the learner wants? Are we understanding the thought process behind that? The second aspect to consider is what kind of design, or what kind of learning design, what kind of learning nuggets, how should we populate learning for the learner? So both these aspects are from a perspective of the learner context. Second is, we all learn when we see our leaders learn, or when we see our peers learn. What is the environment that needs to be created where role modeling of learning can happen? And that can create a lot of stickiness for the learner who is wanting to learn and apply his learning, his or her learning at work. Third will be, okay, now I've understood the learner's psyche. I have also made sure that there is role modeling happening when it comes to learning. But how do I really recognize people who have adopted to learning? That comes as the third part of creating stickiness in organizations for learning and applying learning in the flow of work. And lastly, what better than seeing your peer learn, learning and unlearning with her or him, and ensuring that you're able to discuss what you learned and also see and look for opportunities to actually apply the learning that you both have had. This brings me to the triad, which is a very important consideration when we look at applying learning at work. And who constitutes this triad? The first one, of course, is the learner. The second is the learner's supervisor. And the third is the facilitator. I think all three key people in the triad play a very important role in ensuring that the learning identification is appropriate for the learner. The learner is satisfied with what has been identified as a learning area for her. And thirdly, the facilitator really knows what needs to be delivered in terms of outcome for the learner and what to expect from the learner post the learning session. Let's not forget that the learning curve that is involved in every learning application is very steep. And unless the learner himself is cognizant of it, or the learner's manager is aware of this, it's going to be very difficult to find the right opportunity for the learner to apply the learning back at work. Let's take, for example, you are providing an opportunity to the learner to improve his ability to conduct meetings. Now, that's the most fundamental learning somebody could have, perhaps. However, It's very critical because it is an activity. Conducting meetings is an activity that happens hour on hour and can define or break many serious decisions, right? So in case of such a learning, it's not only enough if we are able to provide the necessary relevant learning nuggets for the learner, but it becomes very critical for us to also identify opportunities for the learner to apply. For example, are you creating spaces for the individual to practice his learning on how to conduct meetings? Likewise, presentation skills, likewise, executive communication, likewise, executive presence. Are you providing the right kind of forums and opportunities for the learner to actually exhibit what he has learned or practice what he has learned as part of the learning journey? The most critical thing will be to, of course, understand that the learning has to be tied to the organization's goals and business needs, as much as the learner sees a personal need for the development area that has been identified for her. On a complete tangent, there are three stages of learning transfer that happens if we observe very closely, right? So before the training, one needs to identify the training need very appropriately. There should be a purpose behind why a learner is put through the rigmarole of learning. um, Define learning outcomes very clearly, not only for the facilitator or not only while you produce digital learning, but make sure that the learner also is aware of what the outcomes are going to be post the learning that he or she is going to be part of. Understand the business outcomes and business needs for that specific learning. And of course, the way you design the course that could excite a learner in his journey. During the learning, it's so important to understand that we need to chunk pieces of learning for the learner. Make it easy for the individual to digest, make it easy for the individual to absorb, and make it easier for the person to apply the learning back at work. Secondly, how are we spacing it? So in the very rapid world that all of us are part of today, spacing becomes very critical. So how are you providing these chunked pieces of information that can be spaced, that can be reinforced, and that the learner can connect to? That is the most important thing. So how does the learner associate the learning with something that he or she has experienced in the past, which makes learning much more compelling and which makes learning much more relevant to the individual? So during the stages of learning transfer, chunking, spacing, ensuring that there is an association that the learner can make with the learning, and finally, make sure that the learning is relevant to the learner. Now, what do you do in the third stage, which is post the learning? How are you going to ensure that there is stickiness for the learning and there is an opportunity for the individual to practice what he or she has learned? Now, this can't be always from the organization. The learner has a very strong responsibility in identifying possible opportunities for applying the learning, right? So responsibility from the organization and responsibility from the learner to make sure that there are relevant opportunities for applying learning in the flow of work. Second could be, how are we identifying feedback partners? So we've learned something. Now we are also applying it at the workplace. As a learner, have you found a feedback partner who can be very candid with the extent of progress you're making with respect to one or two learnings that you've had? And thirdly, for creating stickiness and for ensuring that you are able to have a memory recall, are you able to document your learning? Maybe a small paragraph, maybe a small nugget of what you have learned that can be documented. And by writing something, I tell you, it's the most powerful way of learning. So, there are certain aspects that we saw that need to be considered before, during, and post the training for stickiness to actually be created for learning and also enable learning transfer in the most appropriate way. Now, coming to a dimension of what is called active learning. There are multiple ways in which people learn. And active learning is probably the most powerful and a beautiful way of making sure that we are building capability and developing skills in individuals and in organizations. So, what does active learning really mean? Active learning is that form of learning where learning stays. It helps employees to successfully apply their learning at work, which is the thought throughout today. And thirdly, it's a combination of not only understanding, it extends beyond understanding and application, but it leads the individual to be very powerfully reflecting on the concepts. This leads me to what we call the learning loop. The most powerful aspect of learning is when we do something, we understand our gaps, we reflect on it, we see what are the other things that one needs to be doing, right? And this powerfully, the consequent movement of reflection and application repeatedly brings in a lot of reinforcement and insights into the learning pathway that we would like to adopt. So what is a learning loop? So one, you have certain experiences, you have certain things that you have learned, which is giving you a direction in terms of whether something is working right, or your experience tells you that there are a few areas in which we need to buckle up. Now, this experience or this insight leads us to the next step, which is, okay, what is the gap that I need to be identifying that needs to get plugged for me to be having a very powerful learning journey, not only learning, but also making sure that it is applied at work. Now, once you apply this at work, how do you know if you are really doing it right or it needs betterment? And that is where the power of feedback comes into play. And just a while ago, I indicated that peer feedback can be a very powerful way of learning and unlearning concepts, learning and unlearning experiences, and learning and unlearning insights itself, right? So you seek feedback, and from feedback, there's a lot of observation and reflection that one needs to constantly do. So while you get your feedback, there are certain things you may agree, there are certain things that you might not, right? So how is your reflective process structured? How much time are you taking to reflect on the inputs that you've received from your peers makes a huge difference. Now, once you've started reflecting and summarizing what you need to get better at, you need to start obviously looking at course corrections that needs to be done. So you've been in a meeting, you've applied certain concepts of driving the meeting very powerfully through a learning program that you have attended. You've been given feedback that certain areas of running the meeting were perfect, but a couple of areas needed improvement. Have you reflected on that? Now, once you've reflected on the facts that have come to you in terms of improving, what is the course correction you're doing before the next meeting that can really show that you are having this reflective process of learning and you are changing for the better in terms of the skills that need to be developed, and you're very conscious about the skills that you need to develop. And that is the last piece, which is around course correcting and repeat learning that is required for all of us during our work in an organization. Now, what does this learning loop mean? So the first question that you will ask is, which part of my learning is really working for me? It starts with that reflection. So what are the data points that is pushing you towards understanding that? What are the insights that push you to understanding that? The second question that you should be asking is, what is really not working for me? You should know some things are working well and some things are not working well. So what is it that is not working for me? What are some of the assumptions I'm having? Am I having perceptions that is preventing me from seeing the reality? The third one is, are there gaping holes or gaps that I really need to be looking at? And what is the current issue that I'm trying to resolve through this learning process? Is it adding an input for my journey into getting better? And lastly, once you understand, you reflect, and you've started applying, the question will be, is there specific outcomes or feedback that I'm receiving from my manager? Is it a feedback that I'm receiving from my peer? And what is the review that I really need to be doing before I step into the next learning loop? So it's a constant cycle that a learner has to have if he or she needs to apply learning at the workplace. And it's a very powerful approach to understand the way you learn, understand what is the output, and understand how you can get better with respect to the outputs that you're creating. But more than anything, I think learning agility is a very, very critical element for a learner, for him to be synergizing the learning and applying it at the workplace. So, what are some ways in which we can reinforce learning? One is definitely through peer groups. So, you have a group of people who've been part of a learning program. How are we getting together post a month, post or at regular intervals to see what is the progress we are making? How much has the needle shifted from the place where we were to post the learning and the place that we are today? Second, what kind of social learning opportunities have I created for myself? Third, have I taught somebody else what I have learned? And it's ancient wisdom that the minute you teach and the minute you're responsive to questions that come from the other side, your learning deepens. So have you found options for teaching one more person something that you have learned from the learning session that you attended? Like I said, how are you documenting the learning application? Because writing is a very powerful way that's connected right up to your brain, and it reinforces, strengthens, it helps you retain a lot of memory about the application, helps you retain and recall what you have applied several years later. Fifth, are you really talking about what you have learned and what you have applied? Because also conversing about what you've done deepens your learning. And finally, I think as learning architects, it's not only enough if we ensure that we create peer groups, or we are looking at social learning, or we are looking at opportunities being provided for the learner to be teaching someone else for strengthening his learning, or ensuring the documentation of the learning is happening. But what are the, learning aids, or what are the review aids that we are providing supervisors so that they can really know the progress made by the individual? I think all of this plays a very, very big role in the synergy of learning, and how learning is really tied to work. So one, we spoke about creating stickiness for learning. Two, we spoke about pre, during, and post learning transfers that we need to understand. Three, we spoke about the importance of peer reviews. We spoke about supervisors being provided aids to kind of really understand the progress that the learner has made. We spoke about social learning. We touched upon teaching people to strengthen application at work. We spoke about documenting the learning. We also spoke about talking about the learning and its application in multiple forums. I would like to end by saying that if you want a synergy between the learning that the organization provides you and strengthen your own application of learning, then it's a huge responsibility on oneself to make sure that you find the right opportunities to apply learning at work. On the other hand, organizations and managers must also be on their toes to provide refresh learning opportunities and opportunities for action learning projects, perhaps to implement what the learner has learned. So it's a two-way responsibility that I see when it comes to learning application at work, both from the organization and from the individual. I hope you benefited from my insights as much as I have as I've been speaking. Thank you so much for today. Bye bye.